Great. Let's begin with key point 1. The Shockwave Begins, a one-page tariff list that paralyzed Wall Street. Stock markets that manage trillions of dollars don't usually freeze. But that's exactly what happened the moment a one-page tariff list from Brussels leaked into Wall Street terminals. It wasn't dramatic at first, just a file quietly uploaded to internal servers. But within seconds, the screens changed. The vibrant colors traders rely on to track movement, green for gains, red for losses, suddenly turned flat, like someone pulled the plug on the entire system. This wasn't just a software glitch, it was a shockwave. The list from Brussels detailed the European Union's long-awaited retaliation against new U.S. tariffs. And even before any official response came from Washington, the effect was instant. Traders understood this was serious. Not just political posturing, actual money, jobs, and factories were on the line. Within minutes, the same signal traveled from Wall Street to the industrial heart of America. Assembly lines in Detroit, aircraft hangars in Seattle, grain elevators in Iowa, they all felt it. Procurement teams froze orders. Export managers held emergency calls. Suddenly, all the bright blue columns in Washington's export tables were fading into gray. And that's because the document wasn't just symbolic, it was a surgical strike. Brussels wasn't slapping random penalties. It was targeting the very core of U.S. industrial power, aviation, and automobiles. The message was clear. Europe wasn't just closing its doors, it was locking them. So how did a single leaked file from across the Atlantic trigger a potential $66 billion blackout in U.S. industry? Let's take a closer look. The numbers hit like a punch to the gut: 66 billion euros in lost U.S. industrial exports, wiped out in one move. This wasn't a general trade slowdown or a diplomatic warning. It was a precision-engineered retaliation plan from the European Commission, aimed at the backbone of U.S. exports: planes, cars, and industrial machinery. Brussels had done its homework. Officials stood in front of cameras with calm faces, but the numbers they presented were anything but calm. They said, "We calculated it down to the last millimeter. That's not just a figure of speech. Every item on the list, from aircraft engines to car parts, was selected based on its strategic value and political pressure point. The result? A direct hit on America's top-performing sectors. Aviation and automotive goods make up a huge share of U.S. industrial exports to Europe. Combined, they bring in over 66 billion euros annually. Now, all of that is at risk. And it's not just the headline numbers. Every euro lost in exports is someone's canceled contract, idle machine, or empty loading dock. What makes this even more devastating is how targeted it was. Europe didn't go after random goods. It went after symbols of U.S. economic strength, the things Washington likes to show off in trade reports. These weren't just tariffs. They were chess moves, designed to create maximum economic pain with minimum political backlash inside the EU itself. Even agriculture didn't escape. On paper, the hit to farm exports was only 6 billion euros, but that small number packs a punch in U.S. swing states. The Midwest, with its soybeans, corn, and cattle, is deeply exposed. And every tariff slapped on farm goods is another headache for the White House heading into an election year. This wasn't a trade disagreement, it was an industrial ambush. Now, let's zoom in on the first major casualty, the American aviation sector. If you want to hurt a country's industrial engine, you don't go after toys or t-shirts. You go after airplanes. That's exactly what Europe did. Right near the top of the Brussels tariff list were some of the most expensive and complex goods the U.S. exports: aircraft fuselages, jet engines, avionics systems, carbon fiber wings. These aren't just big-ticket items. They're products that depend on years of engineering, billion-dollar factories, and delicate global supply chains. The timing couldn't have been worse. A major U.S. aircraft manufacturer based in Seattle had just reported a strong European order book. 137 new units were scheduled for delivery across the EU. Then came the tariffs. Within days, customers began asking for changes, delays, cancellations, not because they don't need planes, but because they don't want to pay extra taxes or risk more uncertainty. It's not just Seattle feeling the hit. Think about how airplanes are made. A jet might be assembled in Washington state, but its aluminum comes from Kansas. Its software, written in Arizona. Its lightweight composite materials, shipped in from South Carolina. One cancellation echoes across dozens of suppliers, each of them losing revenue, cutting shifts, freezing new hires. So why did Brussels go so hard after aviation? Simple. Because aviation has long production cycles and long financing chains. One canceled order today might take 3 to 5 years to refill, if it gets refilled at all. Plus, most of these deals are backed by EXIM financing. If tariffs cause even small payment issues, loan structures collapse. Planes get grounded on spreadsheets before they're ever built. And let's not forget Europe's advantage. Airbus, Boeing's biggest rival, suddenly looks like the cleaner, cheaper option. No tariffs, lower carbon footprint, ready delivery slots. Europe didn't just retaliate, it took out a competitor without spending a single euro on advertising. As Boeing looks for answers, let's head east to Detroit, where another industrial giant is facing its own storm. Detroit thought it might dodge the bullet. When the European Commission's initial tariff draft was leaked, passenger cars were nowhere to be seen. That gave American automakers a brief sigh of relief. Maybe the EU would spare them. But that didn't last long. Behind closed doors, Brussels was recalculating. By the time the May and July revisions were finalized, passenger vehicles were back on the list. And this time, there was no way around it. The final document made it official. A 25% import tax on US-made cars entering the EU effective August 1st. That's a massive problem for Detroit. Here's why. Under the USMCA, the US-Mexico-Canada trade agreement, only a small portion of US cars meet the strict rules of origin that the EU will accept for tariff exemptions. Analysts ran the numbers. 4 out of every 5 American cars exported to Europe will not qualify for the exemption window. They'll hit the 25% wall head-on. The financial damage? Estimates show between 8 to 10 billion euros in U.S. auto exports will vanish almost overnight. That's not a dent, that's a crater. This hits hardest at a time when U.S. car makers are already under pressure. GM recently admitted its electric vehicle budget couldn't handle any more cost increases. Now, with new EU tariffs and climate-linked taxes piling on, its executives are using a new term margin compression, which is just a fancy way of saying we're losing money. Ford, meanwhile, has been working on shaving a few cents off battery prices just to stay profitable in the hybrid market. But cents don't matter when Brussels drops a 25% dollar bomb. And it gets worse. If your electric SUV uses aluminum sourced from Kentucky, which is carbon intensive, you now pay a carbon tax on top of the import tax under the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism. That's double taxation with a green twist, a tariff on your car, and a penalty for how you built it. While American brands are scrambling, their German rivals, Volkswagen, BMW, Mercedes, are standing firm. They're not affected by these new EU tariffs, and their sales teams are already using it as a marketing pitch. No extra taxes, no trade drama, just better value. One Paris car dealer summed it up perfectly. Our stock hasn't moved in 4 months. Now, the Americans just gave us a gift. But cars and planes aren't the only sectors hit. There's another layer of pain that's harder to see, but just as devastating. Let's talk about medical devices and the forgotten middle of the supply chain. While all eyes are on Detroit and Seattle, another sector quietly started bleeding medical devices. Pacemakers, orthopedic implants, diagnostic scanners. These aren't just expensive exports. They're also highly specialized, often life-saving technologies. And for years, U.S. medtech firms assumed they were too essential to target. Europe needs these devices just as much as the U.S. needs to sell them, right? Wrong. The EU flipped the strategy. Instead of sparing the sector, it hit it hard, then offered a partial walkback. In May and July, Brussels first imposed high tariffs on many U.S. medical exports. Later, it introduced selective reductions, as if to say, we'll ease the pain, but only on our terms. But by then, the damage was already done. Medical suppliers don't operate on month-to-month flexibility. They rely on long-term trust and stable contracts. Once a buyer in Berlin or Marseille sees prices spike, they look elsewhere, and fast. Even if the tariff is reduced later, the contract is already lost. Take the case of a small but successful Connecticut-based company that made $20 million a year selling disposable surgical gowns to French hospitals. Now, that deal has moved to a Spanish competitor. The American firm's costs jumped overnight. Between tariffs, shipping, and currency shifts, it simply couldn't compete. Or look at a California company that makes drone camera modules for medical imaging. It just lost a deal in the Western Balkans, not because of performance or price, but because the euro-dollar spread reversed due to tariff shocks. In trade terms, they lost before they even pitched. This is the middle layer of the economy, the suppliers, tech firms, and niche exporters that don't make headlines but carry entire sectors on their backs. When tariffs hit, they're the first to fall. And unlike Boeing or Ford, they don't have lobbyists or multi-country factories to hedge the blow. Now imagine this is happening across the map. Because while the EU was the first to fire, it's not the only one locking down. Let's zoom out and look at how the rest of the world is circling the US export economy. What started as a transatlantic standoff is now becoming a global chain reaction. The United States thought it was only dealing with the European Union, but, while Washington built its 30% tariff wall, other nations quietly started laying bricks of their own. The result? A widening ring of economic isolation that even America's biggest exporters didn't see coming. Canada was the first to follow Brussels' lead. In response to U.S. steel and aluminum tariffs, Ottawa activated its own metal shield, targeting not just raw materials but also finished products. For American suppliers in the Rust Belt, that meant immediate disruption in cross-border contracts. And for factories in Michigan and Ohio, it was a sharp reminder that even close allies won't stay quiet forever. In the Gulf states, a different kind of retaliation is brewing. Officials in Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar are reviewing oil, gas, and LNG contracts. These nations are critical energy partners, but now they're looking to lock in more favorable terms with Asian and European buyers who aren't entangled in tariff wars. U.S. energy exports, once dominant, are being quietly squeezed out of future deals. Then there's South Korea, whose response is perhaps the most calculated. Seoul has tucked away a triple retaliation strategy, targeting U.S. agriculture, LNG shipments, and yes, aircraft. It hasn't been deployed yet. But make no mistake, the folder exists, and it's ready to open if Washington escalates further. This isn't just about economics. It's about trust. For decades, U.S. companies benefited from the assumption that America was a stable, reliable trade partner. But now, uncertainty is baked into every new deal. Foreign buyers are asking, will this contract survive the next tariff, the next tweet, the next election cycle? In the language of geopolitics, this is called strategic isolation. The United States may be the largest economy in the world, but it's building walls faster than it's building bridges. And while American companies are trying to globalize, moving production to Mexico, Turkey, or the EU, the home market is growing more cut off by the week. Which brings us to the next turning point. What options does Washington really have left? Now the pressure is squarely on Washington's shoulders. With the European Union's €66 billion strike in full force and global retaliation stacking up, the United States is staring at a painful choice. Option 1, back down. Reopen talks with Brussels. Lower Trump's 30% tariff wall. Cut a deal that softens the blow. Maybe reduce EU tariffs to 20 or 25% instead of 100. It wouldn't fix everything, but it could stop the bleeding in Detroit and Seattle. That's the hope behind years of lobbying efforts, white papers, and quiet meetings on Capitol Hill. But here's the problem. It's an election year, and reversing tariffs now, even a little, could look like political weakness. For candidates campaigning on economic strength and America first, backing down before November 2026 would be like waving a white flag. So what's option 2? Stay the course. Keep tariffs high. Hope U.S. companies adapt fast enough to survive. It's a gamble, one that shifts the burden from Washington to the private sector. And they are adapting, but not without cost. General Motors is rushing to expand its warehouse and logistics hubs in Mexico, hoping to reroute some of its EU-facing production. Ford is tweaking its licensing agreements to use engines from Turkey's Kocaeli line for its transit vans, a move that keeps them in Europe's good graces, but complicates U.S. union politics. Even Boeing is exploring a European joint venture for fuselage and wing assembly. That might please buyers in Paris or Berlin, but it's a landmine with U.S. labor unions and voters. These aren't minor shifts. They're strategic pivots. Corporate maneuvers designed to survive a future where Washington stays behind the wall while global supply chains flow around it. But there's a painful irony here. While Washington builds barriers, U.S. companies are being forced to globalize faster than ever. They're outsourcing, relocating, and re-engineering just to dodge the very policies created in their own capital. It's a contradiction so big, it doesn't even fit on a campaign slogan. And the deeper irony, the biggest victims aren't always the giants. Sometimes it's the unsung heroes of the supply chain who end up paying the price. Which brings us to the final, most long-term consequence of this tariff war, how it threatens America's future role in global innovation. Tariffs don't just raise prices. They don't just shift trade routes. Over time, they can rewrite the future. In sectors like aviation and automotive, innovation runs on long cycles, often 10 to 15 years. Whether it's developing next-generation electric aircraft or autonomous vehicle software, companies rely on steady margins to fund their R&D labs. But now, those margins are shrinking fast. If you're a U.S. aircraft maker and your European orders vanish, your profits don't just drop. Your ability to invest in quieter engines, lighter materials, and greener fuels gets delayed. If you're a car maker trying to build the next EV battery or AI-powered driving system, but half your export market is gone, your software team becomes an expense you can't afford to keep. That's the silent threat behind the 66 billion euro blackout. It doesn't just hurt today's balance sheets, it chokes tomorrow's breakthroughs. Meanwhile, Europe is moving in the opposite direction. Brussels isn't just imposing tariffs, it's also increasing subsidies for green tech, offering generous R&D funding and rewarding clean manufacturing with carbon credits. In other words, while the United States is playing defense, Europe is planting seeds for the next industrial revolution. And that's why Brussels focused its tariff fire on cars and planes. Not just because they're valuable today, but because they're the gateway to future tech leadership. Whoever dominates sustainable aviation and smart mobility in the next decade will control not just markets, but standards, patents, and global influence. So this isn't just a trade war, it's a tech war. And right now, the United States is caught in a cycle building walls, losing orders, shifting supply chains, and weakening the very industries it hopes to protect. From Detroit to Seattle, from Connecticut to Kansas, you can feel the pressure. Engineers are nervous, suppliers are looking overseas, startups that once dreamed of IPOs are now wondering if they'll make payroll. This is the blackout, not just of trade, but of confidence, investment, and long-term momentum. And so we're left with one final question. Will this tariff storm force Washington to lower its guard, or will the United States double down, forcing Detroit and Seattle to keep drifting toward Latin America, Eastern Europe, and other cheaper shores, accelerating a painful and permanent shift in globalization? Either way, this engine isn't running like it used to. It's burning more fuel, making more noise, and some pistons are already starting to seize. We'll see in the coming months whether the workers in Michigan and North Carolina go to their next shift or pack their bags, because on both sides of the Atlantic, the real clash is just beginning. What do you think? Will the United States soften its trade stance, or are we witnessing a long-term divide between American industry and its biggest markets? Let us know in the comments. If you found this analysis helpful, make sure to subscribe, hit the like button, and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next deep dive. Thanks for watching.